This is the Constructionist Podcast, where we take ancient stories, the person of Jesus, current events and topics, and help you construct a new Christian worldview that's relevant and loving to those around you. I'm your host, Kevin Bates. I'm a semiotician and community builder, looking at the signs of the times to build a better future together. You are tuned into the Constructionist Podcast, and tonight we are continuing our short mini-series on the Bible, what to believe and what to leave. So at the Constructionist, we encourage a worldview that is built on the principles of Christ, and in this episode, we're examining the Bible through a clear and honest lens. Now, for some, we're probably ruining the Bible. For you who talk about the old stories of the Old Testament and a few of the New Testament, and we give some perspectives that may go against what you've learned on the flannel graphs in your Sunday school. So that might be a problem. Yet by doing so, we hope to offer insights and perspectives that will help you in your own journey towards a greater understanding of love and compassion for yourself and others. So we want to assure you that in tonight's episode, we're not fabricating anything, as many have done. And any information or ideas, we want to give you references to those where we're getting them. And so if you have questions about that, please don't hesitate to message us on the direct messaging or underneath this show in the comment section underneath the social media platform you're listening to. So our goal is to provide an honest and authentic perspective on our examination. So this is our thinking space where we're presenting ideas and thoughts. And tonight we are making a best attempt to explain the story of Noah and some practical thoughts and theologies to live by. So if you enjoy the Constructionist Podcast and want to support us financially, please follow the link in the chat or show notes on the social media platform you're listening to. Visit our Give page. So your support will enable us to continue producing high quality content like this. So important, though, we want to hear from you. We want to engage with you. We believe that our interactions and discussions with listeners like you, we will be able to continue to learn and grow together. And getting your feedback, questions, and ideas are important to us. We value that. We're excited to build a community around a shared exploration of what we call a communal hermeneutic. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us and let us know what you think. All right, Sharia and Jake, thanks for joining us. Tonight, we are covering the story of Noah. Now, there's a lot of thoughts around Noah and the actual historical idea. Was it a historical story? Is it a historical accurate event? Or does it have different meaning? Is there a different meaning to it? I would say that right now, first of all, if you believe that the story of Noah is historical, you can. And if you don't believe the story of Noah is historical, you can also believe that. And no one is condemning anybody or judging anybody for their beliefs. But we want to give you some perspectives tonight that'll help maybe sharpen some things and expand, maybe even blow your mind a little bit about where some of these stories might have been adopted from or directly come from, using actual exact lines and potentially the characters involved are the exact same people. So we want to give you some information tonight that you can explore yourself and maybe discover some new truths for you. So we want to encourage you to do that. So we're not just giving answers to you or just shoving things down towards you. We want to give you space to think as well. And so tonight with the story of Noah, it's sometimes a controversial topic between the literalist and the literary narrative metaphor people. And so sometimes those debates get pretty heated of whether this is a historical accurate event. Now, what we do know is this about the book the book of Genesis and the story of Noah. In about 2900 before Common Era, some people call that BC or BCE. So 2900 BCE or BC, there was some sort of flood. In certain studies, archaeological studies and digs, they have brought up, well, they've dug holes and brought up sediment to show that there was some sort of cataclysmic type devastating flood in the region of Mesopotamia, basically around that time. So in the 1920s, they did some excavation around some of these sites called Ur and Kish to discover where they found flood deposits. They claimed that this split some eras of time, where we had a pre-flood era and a post-flood era. So there's evidences of flood, like in 1959 and 55. Were some other digs where in this area that they definitely found, well, at the time, they definitely found just maybe some evidence of some sort of flood over a long period of time up to 1964. They found that this flood was actually a very large event. To say that that event that they discovered in 2900 BCE, that is not to say that that was necessarily a whole world event. It was isolated in the Mesopotamia area, and it was around that time, probably killed a lot of people or wiped off lots of vegetation and covered the earth to the point that the sediment that was left was about 11 feet thick. So that's a big flood. So we know that this geological idea that a flood did happen in 2900 BCE. Now, let's go from there. Let's start exploring this story of Noah. We're going to read chapter 7 of
Oops. Sorry.
No, you're fine. There we go.
I can read. So the story of Noah actually starts in chapter 6-5 and goes all the way through chapter 9. We're not going to do that because it's a very long passage. But basically, chapter 6 is God giving instructions to Noah to build the ark. Chapter 7 is what we're going to read. I'll just read that now. The Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark with your whole household, because among this generation I've seen that you are a moral man. From every clean animal, take 7 pairs, a male and his mate. And from every unclean animal, take 1 pair, a male and his mate. And from the birds in the sky as well, take 7 pairs, male and female, so that their offspring will survive throughout the earth. In 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. I will wipe off from the fertile land every living thing that I have made." Noah did everything the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters arrived on earth. Noah, his sons, his wife, his sons' wives, with him, entered the ark to escape the flood waters. From the clean and unclean animals, from the birds and everything crawling on the ground, 2 of each, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, just as God commanded Noah. After 7 days, the flood waters arrived on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day, on that day all the springs of the deep sea erupted, and the windows in the skies opened. It rained upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. That same day, Noah, with his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's wife, and his sons' 3 wives, went into the ark. They and every kind of animal, every kind of livestock, every kind that crawls on the ground, every kind of bird, they came to Noah and entered the ark. 2 of every creature that breathes, male and female of every creature went in, just as God commanded him. Then the Lord closed the door behind them. The flood remained on the earth for 40 days. The waters rose, lifted the ark, and it rode high above the earth. The waters rose and spread out over the earth. The ark floated on the surface of the waters. The waters rose even higher over the earth. They covered all the highest mountains under the sky. The waters rose 23 feet high, covering the mountains. Every creature took its last breath, the things crawling on the ground, birds, livestock, wild animals, everything swarming on the ground, and every human being. Everything on dry land with life's breath in its nostrils died. God wiped away every living thing that was on the fertile land, from human beings to livestock to crawling things to birds in the sky. They were wiped off the earth. Only Noah and those with him in the ark were left. The waters rose over the earth for 150 days. Do you want to keep going through chapter 8 or just recap? Okay.
I think just
So chapter 8,
recapping. Yeah.
yeah, chapter 8 is as the waters recede. Noah sends out some birds to see if there's dry land yet. Eventually there is. The ark comes to rest. And then chapter 9 is Noah gives thanks for deliverance, plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and then weirdness happens with his son.
All right. So to do a little more recap on this, because I think it's important, just the idea of Genesis. And what we know is that the first books of the Bible were at least compiled in some form in exile, in Babylonian captivity. And in this Babylonian captivity, people still lived in tribes. And so you had multiple tribes living sometimes way separate. And so certain stories were told in a certain fashion, and those might be slightly different than other stories in other tribes, but eventually those stories came together in what we know as the Pentateuch, these first 5 books of the Bible. So first, to say that the first 5 books of the Bible, or the first books of the Bible, or Genesis or Exodus, was just penned by Moses, is pretty much an inaccurate statement, because we know that these stories were compiled over a long period of time, but mostly compiled in exile, in this Babylonian captivity. But what we do know, which shows even more evidence of this, is these stories are really in a counter narrative form to other stories that were in existence.
Hey,
And
Kevin,
so, yeah,
before we get there, can I give an example that I noticed as we were reading?
yes,
Like
please.
of the two stories being brought together. So in the
Yes,
early part of the chapter, you have 2 of every unclean animal and 7 of every clean animal
yes,
are being brought into the ark. But then later on, in I think it was verse 15, it just says 2 of every animal,
right.
2 of
So
every creature that breathes.
one is specific, one is general.
Yeah, but I think that could be one of these seams where we have 2 different narratives stitched together. Like they're the same
Yeah.
story, but they're being told in different ways.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you for that.
So that's just one way it shows up in the text.
One, yeah, and you can see that it is a mashing, like Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, where you have these 2 different stories, but they're the similar story, or they're the same. But they're written in a way that's counter narrative to some other story that's out there. And the idea of Genesis is like a long version of the same story. It's the creation story, and it's told in multiple forms. So it's told in the original story of creation, and then it's retold in Noah, because Noah, we know, is a recreation story. So it's told in a different fashion in Noah. But it's in a counter type narrative written form, because there was another document out there called the Enuma Elish. And the Enuma Elish is the Babylonian version of creation. So if you have the Babylonian version of creation and the Enuma Elish kind of rolling around, and people are picking up that magazine and they're like, oh, wow, look at this, what's being printed. We have to tell our story. So it's almost like, oh, okay, so you're going to tell this story. Well, we have to tell this story. And this is how our God shows up. This is how Yahweh shows up in our story. So whether or not the authors of Genesis were familiar with Enuma Elish or not, there's no proof that that story was put on their front doorstep as a newspaper. There's no evidence of that. But what there is evidence for is they lived in a very common context or a common culture where those stories at least would have been told, and they would have been perpetuated as our God is better, or, my God is better than your God. And so the God of Genesis basically simply speaks a existence into being, that Yahweh is in control, that Yahweh is the creator, versus some other god that the Babylonians were speaking was the creator. So I just wanted to bring that up first, because there are other stories that the Bible seems like it was written in a contra narrative, a contra like version. And so when we read this, the story of Noah, we can see that as well, which we're going to cover here in a few minutes.
I think as well, what we pointed out when we did our Exodus series a while ago now is that Genesis and Exodus were written to be the same story. And so, same author, same narrative, and one of the main motifs throughout both is that God is bigger than blank. And so,
Right.
in this one, it would be God is bigger than the Mesopotamian folklore story that's flowing around. God is bigger than
Marduk is the god's name.
Marduk, or
Right.
even God placed Noah there instead of who we'll get to a little bit later.
Right.
So it's the God is bigger than.
So let's first talk through a couple of ideas that I think are important. Every time you see water in Hebrew literature, you have a signal, and that signal is rebirth, recreation, renewal, redemption, salvation. So there's an idea of salvation, renewal, and rebirth in this story. One of my favorite authors is Walter Brueggemann, and Walter Brueggemann definitely tells the story that you had this old way of doing things, and now you have a new way of doing things. And so this whole story is built on this idea of renewal centered around water. And so water is a creative substance. Water is, considered the creative substance. And so you see that in Genesis, and you also see that here in the story of Noah, and you see that in the book of Exodus with the Red Sea. You see it all throughout the Old Testament, and you see it in the New Testament with, eventually, you see that with water baptism and the church. So definitely the idea of water is a signal. That's the first thing that I just wanted to make sure to point out. Do you guys have any other thoughts about signals in this passage or in this chapter that we need to pay attention to?
I just want to piggyback on that idea of water, because something we're going to talk about is that there are a lot of cultures who have flood stories, and for many of those cultures, not necessarily all of them, the flood story is also an origin story or a creation story.
Right.
So that, again, kind of links this idea of water to creation in a broader cultural sense than just the Bible.
Mm-hmm. I think the God is bigger than. That would be a motif that goes through it. Water as recreation. How the land and earth is treated is important. Yeah, I think it's good.
The other signal that ties this story to another recreation story is the ark, the Tevah. And the Tevah was a wood boat, right, that was put together with pitch. And that tar, that pitch, kind of held the structure together. That same structure is seen in the story of Exodus where Moses is put in the water in a teva, and that
Mhm.
is also an ark. So Moses, just like Noah, is another Adam, the Adam, then Moses becomes this other Adam, the Adam. So we see that the second and the third type Adam, we see this um, as the carrier, which then if you, which it's not called a teva in the New Testament, but it makes a lot of sense that this feeding trough or this carrier holds the baby Jesus in the cloth and this kind of scene, manger scene.
Mhm.
So the idea of the teva is the holder of the second, third, fourth Adam, and the first of God's like apex of creation. So
So you have
so
the Moses Ark, you have the Ark of the Covenant as
yes.
well. Did you say that?
Okay, yeah. No, I didn't say Ark of the Covenant, but that's a big one.
And then you had Jesus' Ark in the
Mhm.
manger.
Right. So what's unnerving about the story of Noah is, for me, is after reading Walter Brueggemann and his thoughts on Noah, is there's very little subsequent testimony of Noah in the rest of the Bible. We see it in Ezekiel 14. There's references to Noah, but there's challenges that bring up questions. We're going to go over that a little bit later. But there's challenges that bring up lots of questions, because if this was this cataclysmic event, that it would have been referenced at least in some significant ways through scripture. Um, and if that's the case, Exodus has more evidence that it happened than Noah happened. And so just in the subsequent testimony or references to the story. So if it was a big deal, then people would have made it a big deal. So there's more of a case of theology, and Sheree is going to take this portion. There's more of a case of theology here than there's a case of historicity. Because if you just focus on historicity, I think you're just lost in the weeds. And there's no answer to that. You're not going to be able to prove that, not prove that. It's just a rabbit hole that we're going down, and trying to find the ark on mountains and trying to recreate arks and trying to just relive this story like it actually like existed. We're missing the theology of it. And so in the case of this, that God is bigger, like Jake's case of God is bigger, that there's a reversal, that the theology of reversal, the theology of re-love, remembrance, re-blessing, rejoicing. There's this re-blessing. There's a rejoice means re-bless. So there's a change in the world system at some point. And so there's two thoughts that I have going to Sharea's theology here. Is the first thought is there was some flood that existed 2900, and now we have this story of Noah, that the theology of Noah is more important than the historicity of Noah. So let's talk about the theology a little bit. Shreya, take this section, because I really do find this interesting. I loved how you put this together.
Okay. Are you talking about the rainbow and John C.
Yes.
Collins?
Yes,
Is that where
yes,
we are? Okay.
Yeah, that's where we're at.
Okay. So we talked a little bit, I think it was 2 weeks ago in Genesis 1, that we had a creation story, and it was in contrast to the Babylonian creation story. So in the Babylonian creation story, you have Marduk, who is defeating these other gods and creating the earth and all its inhabitants out of the dismembered body parts of these gods. Including one of them is the dragon goddess Tiamat, who is represented by water. And so some folks talk about Genesis 1 creation story as a contrast to that Babylonian story in which God doesn't create with violence, God creates with peace. That I think comes from Walter Wink, but I'm not positive. But then there's another perspective on this that comes from a theologian named C. John Collins, who actually does see God creating with violence in the Genesis 1 narrative in very much the same way the Babylonian narrative occurs. And one of the specifics of that is the dividing of the waters of the sky and the waters of the earth. And that division of the waters is essentially dividing up the dragon goddess Tiamat, who is represented by water. And so in that case, we do have a response to the Babylonian creation story, but it's not one of peace over violence. It's one of our God is mightier than your God. Mm. So if we bring that forward into the Noah story, we have a situation where God has created this world out of violence. God looks at what's going on in the world, and humans have become violent, and God is essentially horrified with how creation has gone. And so God destroys everything but Noah and his family and a few animals and starts again. And at the end of the Noah story, God places a rainbow in the sky. And that word for bow is the same word as bow and arrow. It's the same word in Hebrew. It's the same word in English. So God places God's bow in the sky as a sign of not being willing to destroy the earth anymore. And it's at this point that God chooses to give up violence. So this is a story in which God changes, or at least we see the perspective of the Israelites perspective of God changing. So there you go. That's a tough thing to wrestle with because we don't like the idea of God being violent.
No. And so the change, there's a significant change, I guess, from the God of pre-Noah to post-Noah, symbolized by this bow that God hangs, like retires violence, I guess, right?
I guess I don't know why it can't be both. Like, God had the first creation, the order out of chaos, in peace, and then the God that turns into the destructive mode moves into violence. And at the end of that, probably can't bear it anymore, and so puts up the bow. I don't know why it can't be both.
Maybe it can be. I mean,
why not?
Really, like we don't know, but it could be.
What comes up for me with that idea of order, because of my historical and cultural context, is law and order, right? So this need to impose order on what is viewed as a chaotic populace. And that has me a little bit suspicious because there is violence within a law and order system. It's just obscured.
So let's give we can talk more about the theology of Noah and put that together. But we're kind of building a case here a little bit because and we'll continue with that type of topic. So in the Noah story, in this chapter 6, 7, 8 story of Genesis, we know that Genesis was compiled. We know that Genesis was compiled in exile. We know that there's some counter narrative going on to the Babylonian other stories. And so there's other ideas out there and this shows that our God is better than your God. So we know that those thoughts are happening. There is a story about that great Mesopotamia flood in 2900. And that story is the Sumerian story, the Sumerian flood story that's written in the Eridu Genesis. The Eridu Genesis. I'm pronouncing that the best that I can. The Eridu Genesis. This Genesis story is the oldest, basically, Mesopotamian text that talks about the Great Flood. And that Great Flood, there was a king that survived that Great Flood by the name of Zayud Surah. Zayud Surah is the only survivor, and out of that person, or out of that community that survives, because his family came with, that therefore you had a new populated Earth. So that story, mythicized. Mythicized. Thank you. That story, mythicized over time, becomes our God did this. Now, there was a flood, but there's no spiritual connection to that flood, just, geology. So science and geology happened. A little bit of biology then occurs afterwards, and boom, we have, new Earth. So, but there's no spiritual ideas behind it. So in the ancient world had to spiritualize their stories, or the events, to give honor to God and to give blame to the gods of why basically this flood happens and all these people die, and why a new Earth is created. So God has to be the one. God has to be the one that gets, the accolades and sometimes the blame. So we have this story that is this story of the Mesopotamian. It's the oldest flood story, the Sumerian story, and that story written a very long time ago. That story then is adopted, though. That story then is evolved into another story that we know then in later works, the Atrahasis. The Atrahasis is the 17th century story. And then the Epic of Gilgamesh is, well, actually, that's the older story, and the Atrahasis is the
Newer,
most,
yeah.
I guess, the newer story of these three. So you have the Sumerian story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Atrahasis. So the place, the city of the Mesopotamian story is the Shurupak. And in the instructions of Shurupak, there is this mention of the Sumerian king, the Zayud Surah and such. Also in the Eridu Genesis. Yeah, Eridu Genesis. You have these mentions, but then those names are carried forward in such things like the Epic of Gilgamesh. So I want to read, if I can, if we have time, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of this event. And so I'm going to read this tonight, and I just want you to listen and maybe pick up on some cues and thoughts that you might have because of this story. It goes like this: the ship which you shall build, let her dimensions be measured off. Let her width and length be equal. 10 dozen cubits each was the height of her walls. 10 dozen cubits each were the edges around her. Thrice 3,600 measures of pitch I poured in the oven. Thrice 3,600 measures of tar did I pour out inside her. What living creatures I loaded upon her. I made go aboard all my family and kin, beasts of the steep, wild animals of the steep. The sea grew calm, the tempest grew still, the deluge ceased. I looked at the weather, stillness reigned, and all of mankind had turned into clay. The landscape was flat as a terrace. I opened the hatch. Daylight fell upon my face. The boat rested on Mount Zimush, Nimush, not Zimush, Nimush. Mount Zimush held the boat fast, not allowing it to move. One day, a second day, Mount Nimush held the boat fast, not allowing it to move. A third day, a fourth day, Mount Nimush held the boat fast, not allowing it to move. A fifth day, a sixth day, Mount Nimush held the boat fast, not allowing it to move. When the seventh day arises, I released a dove to go free. The dove went and returned. No landing place came to view. It turned back. I released a swallow to go free. The swallow went and returned. No landing place came to view. It turned back. I sent a raven to go free. The raven went forth, saw the ebbing of the waters. It ate, circled, left droppings, and did not turn back. So that's the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of their version of the story of this Mesopotamian flood. So let's
Sounds
stop
familiar.
there. Yeah, sounds familiar. So let's stop for a minute. Sheree, Jake, you want to recap and make sure that we are not losing people in this, because I want to make sure that everyone is understanding where we are at this point in our teaching.
We're going through the flood narrative with the purpose, I think, to explain that it wasn't written in a vacuum. And so we need to pull out theologies and ideas and ethics out of this, but not historical events that happened. And that when we get bogged down in the historicity of things, we lose the main point of what's being taught. And so tonight we're giving an instruction on what other writings were present when the Old Testament was compiled, because it's a rather new book compared to a lot of the other texts that were floating around, like the instructions of Sirach or the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And you have all these other ideas are floated into this text that we carry.
Right.
And one thing that we keep saying is that the Jewish people in the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE were not monotheists. They just worshipped one God. And so the stories that they tell is how God is bigger than the other gods. Or their nation, Israel, the chosen nation, is greater than the other nations around it, even when it's in captivity. I think that's also a theme that's happening, is that when the Israelite people are dispersed, they are still greater than the nations that do not know God.
Yes. So the story, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, that's like 2100 BCE. And you have
when the exile is after 586
right.
BCE. So that's a difference of almost 1500 years.
Right. The book, like in the Egyptian flood story, that book, that's about 2181 BCE. That's the book of the heavenly. Huh?
There is a Chinese flood story as well around the same time period.
Right. And then you have, like, the Egyptian is called the Book of the Heavenly Cow. That's the 2181. So you have these other stories. Oh, the instruction of Sirach is 2000 BCE. So you have some quite old stories compared to now. There is a claim that the book of Genesis was penned down. The oldest, like the earliest possibility, would be like 1400. More like 600. And so the story, in written form, could be older in oral tradition, but we have to realize that this event happened as a flood, but there's a but there. There's a reason why this was written about that flood. And that's what people miss. Is we want to historically prove that the Noah story is an accurate historical piece of literature, instead of really digging in, why was this even written? And okay, so this flood existed, but why was it written about this flood? Therefore, if I could get to that question versus the historical accuracy of the story, if I could actually get to that question, why was this story written, then I can explore these other stories and not be so threatened. Because these other stories could be counter narratives upon counter narratives, and Noah's story and the biblical narrative is a counter narrative to all of these other narratives. And it could have been that. And I have no problem in saying that and actually agreeing with that and saying that there is a great possibility. Whether the author of the book of Genesis and the Noah story, whether that author had a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, I have no idea. But I can tell you this, that the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Noah are so close together in translated words that I sit there and think, okay, if they didn't have, they must have really collaborated at some degree when they were penning this thing down. So if they didn't have a copy, they definitely had heard the story at some point, at least in oral tradition.
And they were influenced by such. And I think even the ancient kingdom of Israel and Judah would have had text floating back and forth from Mesopotamia.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's safe to say as well. I mean, we like to think that scripture was written in this complete vacuum.
Right.
But it was written in the context and people and lots of history surrounding it.
Right. Shreya, any other thoughts there?
I was just thinking that if you were to take Genesis as a literal historic text, right, you have to have the world being 6,000 years old,
Right.
more or less. Or you have to have, the history starting about 6,000 BC. And then if you take the Noah story as history, that's only going to be another 1,000 years maybe out from the creation story. So we're looking at 5,000 BCE. And to my knowledge, the only archaeological evidence we have of a flood occurring was almost 3,000 years after that, in 2900 BCE. So it doesn't work to take the Noah text as history because it's going to be set 3,000 years too early.
Right. Okay. So let's go back then to the meaning of the story, the theology of the story, because the theology of the story, or the meaning or the teaching of the story, is more important and needs to be more important than, like, this is not a fairy tale. This is not a story of, hey, Noah wins, and this is actually not a children's story. I know people that have claimed that the Old Testament shouldn't be taught in Sunday school. So because it's full of violence. I mean, think about just the motif of the bow in the sky and God hanging up the violence, and saying no more. Basically, you can't get around God saying, I'm no longer going to wipe the entire world off the planet. I promise I won't kill you all ever again like that. I mean, that's like
children.
that belongs in a Nicolas
Everybody.
Cage movie somewhere. I mean, that is
Nicolas
like
Cage.
just Nicolas Cage. That is just like a wild statement. Well, it's Nicolas Cage because of what happens after that with the weirdness. It gets really weird, the story. But so it's not a kid's story, but there are some things that make it very distinctly Hebrew. And number one, you have clean animals and unclean animals. So from every clean animal, take 7 pairs, a male and his mate, and from every unclean animal, take 1 pair. So these poor unclean animals, these split hoofers or whatever, they just are like we're gonna try to wipe you off the planet just by just taking 1 pair, but we get 7 pairs of clean animals. So here's a signaling for me when I say 7, right? I go, okay, 7 complete days. God rested on the seventh day is the Sabbath. So now we have this 7 here. What do we think that actually is in reference to? Why 7 and clean?
Is that a complete amount of animals?
I think that this means
Just enough?
just enough, the wholeness of life there. But in 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Where else do we see 40 days and 40 nights?
Jesus being tested in the wilderness.
Right?
I think
40 years.
the Elijah.
40 years.
Yeah, Elijah, 40 years without rain. Is that correct?
Yep. And then
Yep.
Moses was 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian, and 40 years in the desert.
Yeah.
Something I always question about the clean and unclean animals is why did God save everybody at that point? Everything.
Like the unclean?
Yeah, why was the unclean even added?
Yeah, that's a semiotic trip right there that you need to take.
But also, so the story talks about humankind being wicked. What did the animals do?
They eat their poop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have clean and unclean animals being loaded onto the ark. We have this 7 days. After 7 days, floodwaters came. We have the 40 and the 40 days, 40 nights. All of that is signaling to redemption, salvation, completeness, wholeness, the complete number of creation. It all signals me to redemption. It signals me to salvation. It signals me to recreation. And so the recreation story motif is really important here because in the creation story, it said that the waters were held back like by a dome. And in this story, now we see the waters are being held back and they will be released. The floodgates will be opened and this water will be released again. So it's opening up the chaos again to where we're going to see God is Lord over the chaos. God is Lord over, just like the flies and the bugs and the frogs and the locusts and the boils and the blood in Exodus. We're going to see that that's the chaos in Exodus. If you go back to our Exodus series, this is again the chaos, I guess, in this story when the floodgates are opened. Any other thoughts there?
To make it distinctly Hebrew, the 3 birds, ending with the bird of peace, the bird of like the spirit. Where, if you read the Gilgamesh version, Utnapishtim sends out the dove first. Where in the Hebrew version, it's the dove is last, and the one that is the Spirit of God hovering over the waters to create and to bring new creation. I mean, it's easy. That's low hanging fruit.
Right. Yeah. Low hanging fruit. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I look at this, I see, oh, he waited 7 more days and sent out the dove. So this idea of seven is always here, um, just throughout and noodled throughout this scripture. So then there's this promise. Let's go back to that theology of violence,
Hmm.
because I think that's really important. Is God a violent God?
I think it seems like the Israelites had that perspective at this point in time.
Yeah.
I think the Israelites wanted God to be a violent God.
Why? What's the point of that?
Like if you take liberation theology, and that even physical violence and upheaval to bring about the freedom of people is justified violence.
Hmm.
And so we see it here with the cleansing of the earth of humankind. You see it in the Passover, where the Spirit of God, or God, and that's why I have a hard time with God hanging up God's bow to end all violence, because you see the next, like in a few chapters on the road, God's killing all the firstborn of Egypt.
Right.
Some people have a workaround with that to say it wasn't God, it was God's angel that went in front. But if you read it closely, as well as the Spirit of God went throughout the whole camp and killed.
Hmm.
You have the cleansing of the Canaanites
Hmm.
in the Promised Land. And
But you also have the Egyptians being drowned in the Reed Sea crossing.
and God had direct control over that.
Right. And that's
God
like a
part.
direct parallel to the Noah story.
Mm-hmm. You have, I mean, there's lots of violence for freedom, and I think to say that God is not a violent God is a very privileged perspective.
And also, I mean, I believe that these texts are the thoughts and stories of a people who is trying to make sense of who they are and who God is. And when you're in exile, when your homeland has been besieged for however many years, and the horrors that go along with that, and then you're let out of your homeland, you're forced to live in another culture. You may need to keep your own cultural identity markers secret for your own safety.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's an immense amount of violence and trauma that you've undergone. And so at that point, of course, you want God to overthrow the empire, and
Yeah.
you don't really care who's collateral damage.
Yeah. But that the God is the sum of the collective at that point.
Mm-hmm.
How we view God is how we desire God to be. And I think as well the Old Testament speaks to God thwarts that often.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you read Jeremiah as well, I mean, there is the violence of God is dripping in that text.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
There's a passage where it insinuates that God even rapes Israel. And so what do we do with those things? I think not shying away from them, but really explaining that, you know, that's a narrative, that's a national narrative perspective of how we we view God.
Mhm.
And in our own national narrative, we view God a certain way as well.
Right. So I want to give my opinion of it and then tell me what you think. Is God a violent God? My answer to that is no. God is not a violent God. What I do know is God lets his children tell the story. And how children tell stories is limited by their minds and the culture in which they live. So if a child is telling the story, let's say in school, about their dad, no matter what, telling another student that you don't want your dad to look bad. So you're going to tell the story in a very heroic way. And in a heroic way back then, it would have been told in a very violent fashion because that's the context in which they lived. And God overthrowing wickedness and destroying, that's a very middle school way of talking about your dad. And so when you read these stories, I would say God does allow his children to tell the story. And that story is definitely bounded by cultural context and environment in which they lived. Because it's not until we get really older that we have a perspective on who our dads really are. You know, where we can show appreciation probably for the things that didn't matter back then, but certainly matter now. Like how our dads showed up for this or that, or didn't show up for this or that. We have a perspective on that we can talk maturely about it. But back then we didn't talk maturely about it. So when you're in exile, when you're in captivity, when you have counter narratives, when you're under fear, anxiety, insecurities, when you're trying to figure out how to write a counter narrative to the story of Marduk or some other story that's floating around called the story of the water cow or whatever, right? Where you're dealing with all of these other things, you're going to come up with a pretty sensational story that I actually still believe is God's word. Because what do dads do? When dads hear the stories that are told about them and they sound really good, right? You don't correct those stories. You go, hey, I won. I'm the hero, right? And so I look at these, and sometimes they're sensational, and sometimes they're like, how possibly is this even real? Like the story of Jonah, right? How possibly is this even a story that makes sense, right? Why is this even written? I would say that the same as Noah. Now, that might blow some people's flannel graphs up, you know, the little stitched together Noah and the Ark little flannelgraph thing that we used to play with, you know, that we let our kids play with now. You know, that might blow that whole story up for you, that God's not a violent God because maybe this story is just a story.
And that's okay.
And that's okay. And it has rich theology, has teaching, points me to Jesus, definitely points me to a deeper, that version of the story points me to a deeper, more closer relationship with God than trying to find the boat up on top of a mountain somewhere in the world.
Mount Ararat somewhere, I'm sure.
Somewhere, a mountain there somewhere. Okay. Any other thoughts, closing remarks?
No, that was a lot. I hope people went
Yeah.
with the big curve of that there's lots of flood narratives that
Mhm.
are almost verbatim.
With lots of very intimidating and unfamiliar names.
Yes, very much so. I can't even pronounce them, which is okay.
Just
All right. Sheree, any thoughts? Any more thoughts for tonight?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Thanks, you guys. Appreciate